I didn't know in advance which telecast was going to be played. They normally, when they send out the video cassettes, which we play generally one or two per month of the sermon videos from headquarters. Of course, the others are available to be checked out back there at the table. But along with that, they send a video cassette that normally has about 4 telecasts on there, and we normally play about one a month of one of the telecasts. Since most of us in this area aren't able to get it on television, gives us a chance to keep up with that. We have normally about one a month of the telecast. So what that means, of course, is that there are several that are on there. And as I say, I didn't know what telecast was going to be played over here today. I had just scheduled a telecast, but when it started out, I thought, uh-oh, there goes my sermon. Well, you may notice a little overlap, but we will go perhaps a little further into certain things that Mr. Ames talked about or alluded to in the telecast. I think it's interesting. These are the ones we have right now are some of the summer repeats. This was actually done a number of months ago, but it is being aired right around this time. Would you say that the timing on that is pretty good? Folks have their attention on Jerusalem, and Mr. Ames gave some interesting quotes on there. I would assume most of you have been following the news in terms of the peace summit in Camp David. And, of course, I'm sure you're all convinced President Clinton is going to bring peace in the Middle East. I mean, before he leaves office, that's going to be his legacy. You see, he will have brought world peace and established the millennium. Well, probably not. Don't hold your breath on that account. You see, they can negotiate and even make some hard decisions about a lot of things. But when it comes down to Jerusalem, there's not a whole lot of range to compromise. All the Israelis, they said, well, there's some little villages sort of out, suburbs on the east side of Jerusalem that are basically Palestinian villages. If you want part of Jerusalem, I'll tell you what we'll do. We will just extend the city limits, and we will take in some of those little Arab villages out on the out east of Jerusalem, and we'll just take those into the city limits of Jerusalem, and then we'll give you that part. Well, that's not what they want. They already have that part, and the fact that the Israelis say, well, we'll call that Jerusalem, and that can be yours, and you can have part of it too. That's not the part they want. They want that part, but they want to draw the line at the 1967 dividing line. One of the things to understand, interestingly, as far as the comparison, there have been comparisons drawn between the Camp David meetings this time and the Camp David meetings of back, almost 3 decades ago, back over 2 decades ago anyway, a little over 2 decades ago, late 70s, when the President Jimmy Carter hosted the Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, and President Sadat of Egypt. And, of course, the situation was a little bit different. Number one, Jerusalem was not the issue. Number two, Begin and Sadat were both very strong leaders, very much in control at home. Prime Minister Begin had a large majority in the Knesset and was in a very strong position to follow through on an agreement that he made. President Sadat pretty well ruled Egypt the way he wanted to, and was in a position to do what he wished. Of course, the United States wound up and anteed up what amounted to several $billions annually that we have been giving Israel and Egypt ever since that time in payment to them of signing the Camp David Accord. So there was interesting, you see, when they finally agreed on it, part of the agreement was that we would pay between the two countries, I think it amounted to about $4 billion annually that we have been doing, most of it going to Israel, part of it going to Egypt, that they're still getting to this day as their price for having signed it. If you noticed something in the paper the other day, some of the President Clinton's aides were suggesting that it may cost, that if they get an agreement signed this time, it may cost the United States $40 billion. Anyway, you realize one of the things they've been talking about over at the Japanese summit of the 8 industrial nations is, can we talk some of them into anteing up and sort of kicking money into the pool to pay off the Arabs and the Jews to get them to sign an agreement. So there is a great deal of pressure building. Yasser Arafat is not in a strong position among the Palestinians. In fact, the overwhelming majority of the Palestinians say that they will not support anything that doesn't give them everything they want. Well, needless to say, Prime Minister Barak is not in a position to give them everything they want, even if he were willing to give them everything they want. He couldn't get the support in Israel. There's no way that they're going to agree to simply redraw the line according to the 1967 boundaries. So they are locked in a situation where they're going around and around. Somebody has compared it to putting 2 scorpions in a bottle. If you've ever done that or seen that, you notice how, they sort of go around and around pointing their tails at one another, seeking to, they sort of do their dance, but it can be a very deadly dance. So there is a pressure that is building over there, and I think one of the things that's going to be interesting, that as we watch the results of it, will tend to show the extent to which things are going to speed up in Bible prophecy, or the extent to which things may go along at sort of a level pace for a little bit longer. There are many pressures that are building up, and the Middle East is a very focal point of some of these things. And the time is going to come when these events are going to break forth on the world scene in a way that is absolutely unimaginable to the overwhelming majority of people right now. The events that are going to unfold are going to catch the world by shock and by surprise. Now, there is going to come on the world scene a time of great crisis that will produce what most people will view as a solution. Jesus Christ in Luke chapter 21, we often go to Matthew 24, which is a parallel account. Mark 13 is also a parallel account, but let's focus our attention today on the account given in Luke chapter 21. This event occurred a short time prior to the final Passover of Jesus Christ. He was in Jerusalem at the temple just prior to the Passover. And chapter 21 starts out with the story of people putting money in the treasury of the temple, and a certain poor widow who cast in her 2 mites. And Christ observed to the disciples that she had truly given more than they ought, because not in let's say the amount, but she had given everything she had. The others never missed it, and she gave. They gave out of their abundance, Christ said. Now, as they were coming through the temple, they noticed this, and Christ commented on it, and then some of them began to speak of the temple as to how it was adorned with goodly stones and gifts. They noticed that they were commenting about how beautiful it was and all of the grandeur. And as for these things, Jesus said, as for these things which you behold, the days will come, verse 6, in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Well, that was a remarkable statement. They looked at a great, grand, massive building. The temple complex covered almost 40 acres, about 37 acres actually. Herod had built up a retaining wall. When you hear about the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall, that was not actually the wall of the temple. That was a part of the that was a part of the retaining wall that Herod had built up to expand the Temple Mount. He almost tripled the size of the Temple Mount. What they did was a very steep country. If you've ever seen much pictures, I don't know, some of you may have even been to Israel on the at the feast time or something, but you see that the terrain is very rugged. It's very hilly. And so what Herod did was he built this massive retaining wall. They hauled in rocks and dirt and leveled it out to expand the area of the Temple Mount, and then paved on it. And he expanded the buildings, built up the walls and the porches and all sorts of things. So this was a part of the overall temple complex. He greatly expanded it, made it possible for multiple tens of thousands more people to actually be in the temple complex and the courtyards at the same time by building this retaining wall and expanding out the top of the Temple Mount. It was a massive engineering project, as you can imagine, and so it is a part of that. The part of the ancient retaining wall of the Temple Mount is what is still standing there from that time. All of the buildings and everything that was a part on top was destroyed, but the retaining wall there, that western wall that Herod built, is still there. Of course, the Arabs have come in and have built new buildings on top of the Temple Mount. But all of the things that they saw in terms of the temple complex, the temple itself and all of the various courtyards and areas for the priests and areas for storage and porches and all of the things that adorned the top of the temple, all of those things were destroyed, just as Jesus said. Well, they asked him in verse 7, saying, Master, when shall these things be? What sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? So they were taken aback and they wanted to know. He said, Take heed that you be not deceived, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and the time draws near. Go you not therefore after them. Now what we find is you put the account in Luke 21 together with the one in Matthew 24. The full question they ask is recorded in Matthew 24:3. Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So they telescope together two different things. The destruction of the temple and the return of Jesus Christ to this earth. Now, what we find is that the destruction of the temple was to be, and the destruction of Jerusalem, was a type of an event that was going to come in the future. Just hold your place. We're going to come right back to Luke 21, but let's go back to the book of Ezekiel, and we'll notice here in Ezekiel chapter 4. Now, Ezekiel, remember, was a Jewish captive in the area of Babylon. And northern Israel, the northern kingdom, had been taken captive well over about 130 or 40 years earlier, about 130 years earlier than the events recorded here in Ezekiel 4. They had been taken captive by the Assyrians and settled up in the northern area, sort of between the Black and the Caspian Sea. That was the house of Israel. Now notice, Ezekiel was told in Ezekiel 4, here he is a Jewish captive, taken captive by the Babylonians, settled down in southern Mesopotamia, in the area near Babylon. And he's told in Ezekiel 4 verse 1, You also, son of man, take you a tile, and lay it before you, and portray upon it the city, even Jerusalem. And lay siege against it, and build a fort against it, and cast a mount against it. Set the camp also, and set battering rams. Now, Ezekiel was told that he was to take a tile, probably just a piece of ceramic tile, or some sort of a paving tile, and he was to use it as the basis of building a little model city. Now, this must have attracted people's attention. They saw Ezekiel working on this thing. It's like, what in the world are you doing? Well, he built a little model of Jerusalem. And he built up, it was like little toy soldiers, and he had battering rams, and he had all these things set around, a little model portraying the siege of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem was laid siege within a very short time, within just a few years of the time that Ezekiel wrote this. Within a matter of 5 or 6 years, Jerusalem had been laid siege and captured and destroyed by the Babylonians. So that was going to happen. That was something that was going to occur. So Ezekiel builds this little model city with depicting the siege of Jerusalem. In verse 3, he was told, "Moreover, you shall take unto you an iron pan, and set it for a wall of iron between you and the city. And set your face against it, and it shall be besieged, and you shall lay siege against it. This shall be a sign to the house of Israel." This shall be a sign to the house of Israel. So the events that were going to occur in Jerusalem, he depicted the siege of Jerusalem. The siege of Jerusalem was to be a sign. It was a type of something for the house of Israel. The siege of Samaria was not particularly a sign for the house of Israel. The siege of Jerusalem by the Babylonians was in reality a type of the Great Tribulation. The event that is described, the horrors that are described in the book of Lamentations. Lamentations was written after the death of King Josiah, the last righteous king of Judah. The promise had been made to Josiah that the affliction that was going to come upon the Jewish state would not occur in his lifetime. Josiah died, and within a very short time, there began to be Babylonian incursions and the initial capture of Jerusalem and the beginning of deportations, the three different times when Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem, basically 604, a few years later in 596, and then a few years later in 586. And by 586, he destroyed Jerusalem, burned the temple, destroyed everything. Well, the book of Lamentations was written by the prophet Jeremiah in the aftermath of Josiah's death. It was not written simply as a lament for the man, Josiah, though he was certainly an outstanding king and an outstanding man. But when you go through the book, it is descriptive of the calamities that were going to overtake the nation, and the things that were going to occur. That is described, you see, in the book of 2 Chronicles chapter 35. That 2 Chronicles 35:25 tells us Jeremiah lamented for Josiah, and all the singing men and singing women spoke of Josiah in their lamentations to this day, and made them an ordinance in Israel. And behold, they're written in the Lamentations. Well, now what Lamentations was made an ordinance, was made a part of Scripture? Well, it was the Lamentations of Jeremiah that are described there. And it goes through and it describes the horrible calamities, prophetically referring not only to the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians that occurred a few years after Josiah's death, but those events, as Ezekiel 3:3 shows, or Ezekiel 4:3 shows, those events were a sign to the house of Israel. Now, Jesus Christ, in His day, spoke of what was for them a yet future destruction of the temple, an event that would occur within 40 years of the time Jesus spoke the words, an event that would occur during the lifetime of many people who were then extant. That was an event that was in many ways very much paralleled, very much patterned after the events of 600 years earlier, the destruction by the Babylonians. In fact, interestingly, the two destructions occurred on the exact same day. The exact same day, just about this time of the year. Just about this time of the summer, the 9th of Ab, the 9th day of the 5th month of the sacred calendar. So, the destruction by the Babylonians and the destruction by the Romans. So Jesus described and talked about the destruction of the temple that was going to occur, but in reality, that destruction and the events surrounding it were still a type pointing to the things that preceded His return to this earth. So all of the events historically of the destruction of Jerusalem serve as a sign to the house of Israel and are a type of the events that we are going to go through and experience in this nation and in Canada and in Britain in the modern house of Israel. Now Jesus, let's go on in Luke 21. Jesus talked about those who would come in His name. Who would come in His name, preaching a false Christianity. A false Christianity. They will come in my name. You know, He talks about in Mark 7 and other places about the fact that there would be a number who would say, well, haven't we done all these things in your name? Matthew chapter 7, 22 says, many will say unto me in that day, Lord, Lord, haven't we prophesied in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name done many wonderful works? Jesus said, yes, many will come in my name. People claiming to do all sorts of things, but not everyone that comes in the name of Christ really represents Jesus Christ. Mark 7 and Matthew 7 make that very plain. Matthew 7 talks about false prophets. And how do you know? Well, you know them by their fruits. Jesus says to those who profess His name and yet do not obey what He said, depart from me, you workers of iniquity, I never knew you. Depart from me, you that work iniquity, you that practice lawlessness. I never knew you. Well, Luke chapter 21, he talks about in verse 8, false prophets. And in verse 9, when you shall hear of wars and commotions, don't be terrified. These things must first come to pass. The end is not by and by. It's not immediately. Nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. Great earthquakes shall be in different places, famines, pestilences, fearful sights, great signs shall there be from heaven. Before all these, they shall lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and into prisons, being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. Now, as he describes the events in verse 11, he describes various things, including famine and disease epidemics, and then he describes great signs, sights and signs in the heavens. Now, if you go back to Revelation 6 and Matthew 24, we get the time sequence laid out a little more detailed in that the heavenly signs are the sixth seal. Matthew 24 tells us that immediately after the tribulation of those days, there will be signs in the heavens. And that's in Matthew 24:29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, stars fall from heaven. Revelation 6, and going through the seals that are opened one by one, shows that the fifth seal is religious persecution, and the sixth seal is the heavenly signs. So that's why Luke 21, as he goes through and just describes various of these calamities, and then says in verse 12, before all these, they will lay hands on you. In other words, certain of these things will have occurred in terms of the false prophets and the wars and the famine and disease, but prior to the heavenly signs, persecution will take place. It describes a religious persecution when Christ said, delivering you up to the synagogue. In other words, to the guardians of the official religion. So it's religious persecution. And it talks about imprisonment. It talks about the civil rulers getting involved. And Christ said, "It shall turn to you for a testimony." You will have opportunity to bear record of me, bear witness of me and my message when that time occurs. So don't worry about it. Don't worry about what you're going to say. I will inspire you at that moment. He talks about in verse 16, people being betrayed by family members and by friends. People turning on one another. Talks about that sort of thing. Horrible descriptions of what will occur. You go back and you read history and you find out this sort of thing has happened over and over. It will happen to those who are not close to God and are not walking with God. You get under a lot of stress and pressure and duress, and unless you're really drawing on God's strength, you can wind up and do some things you don't think you would do. You know, Matthew 24 talks about many being offended and hating one another. People getting upset with one another and then turning hostile, being prepared to betray one another. But he says, don't worry about it. Verse 18, "There shall not a hair of your head perish. In your patience possess you your souls." Do what you're supposed to do and trust God. He'll take care of you. Verse 20, "When you shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is near." Now, let me ask you a question. What is going to be unique about Jerusalem being compassed with armies at that time? Jerusalem has been compassed with armies many times. Been compassed with all sorts of armies. Mr. Ames in the telecast alluded to when the Turks captured it from the Egyptians, and the British captured it from the Turks, and of course the Jews and the Arabs fought there in 48 and 67, and Jerusalem in both of those occasions was surrounded by armies, Jew and Arab. Jerusalem has been encompassed with armies many times. It hasn't always been destroyed by those armies. Sometimes it's simply been captured. That was destroyed by the Babylonians and by the Romans. But what is it Christ is talking about? "When you shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know the desolation thereof is near. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let them which are in the midst of it depart out. Let not them that are in the countries enter thereunto. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled." This is it, he says. Woe to them that are with child, those that have little tiny infants in those days. It's going to be very, very difficult, because there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon the people. When times are hard and difficult. Who is it the hardest on? Well, certainly, little tiny children, mothers who are, expectant mothers, or mothers that have little babes in arms. It's going to be a very, very difficult time. Verse 24, "They'll fall by the edge of the sword, be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And there shall be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars and the earth, distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's heart failing them for fear, for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. The powers of the heaven shall be shaken. Then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory." So, we're looking at a series of events that culminates with the return of Jesus Christ. Now let's understand a little more fully. Let's go back to the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 11. We will pick the story up. The kingdom of Babylon had fallen. In fact, the city of Babylon had been captured, and Cyrus had placed Darius the Mede on the throne of Babylon. And Cyrus had taken his army and gone elsewhere, and Darius the Mede ruled as king in Babylon for a couple of years. And Daniel, of course, had really been sort of retired before that point. He was sent for by Belshazzar, who was the last of the Babylonian kings. You remember, the very night that began the Feast of Trumpets, actually. Daniel was summoned by Belshazzar, and he interpreted for him the handwriting on the wall. And that very night, Belshazzar was slain, and the city of Babylon fell to the Medes and the Persians. Well, Daniel, in that sense, was sort of brought back out of semi-retirement. He was in his 80s, and so in the last year of Darius, in the first year of Darius the Mede, chapter 11, verse 1, I stood up to confirm and to strengthen him. So Daniel was there to try to help. And now we find that this is a continuation of some of the events that are described in Daniel chapter 10, that there is an angel. Gabriel is actually speaking to Daniel, and this is described when he sees the angel that's talking to him, and the angel tells him in Daniel 11 verse 2. You have to go back to Daniel 10 to pick up the context. Now I will show you the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. Now that 4th king refers to Xerxes, who was a very mighty and powerful king that sought to launch an invasion of Greece. Put together an army of 1,000,000 men to invade Greece, and they were turned back. And that, of course, really stirred up enmity in terms of the Greeks against the Persians. And so verse 3, a mighty king shall stand up and shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven and not to his posterity. Now this mighty king that was to stand up was Alexander the Great, the king who united the Greeks and invaded and conquered the Persian army, the Persian Empire. That story is given in more detail in Daniel chapter 8, where it talks about the goat with the 2 horns, which represented the kings of Media and Persia, we're told in Daniel 8:20, and the rough goat being the king of Greece, Daniel 8:21, and it was broken, verse 22, and 4 kingdoms stood up out of the nation, but not in his power. And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance, understanding dark sentences, shall stand up. So we find that it's specifically identified in Daniel 8 that we're talking about Greeks and the Persians, and this great king, this mighty king of Greece that would stand up and be the first leader there, and yet he would be broken, he would die, and his kingdom would be divided among 4 of his generals. And that, of course, happened historically. Alexander died, and within a matter of a few years, 4 of his generals had divided his empire among themselves. It was still a Greek empire, Greek religion, Greek culture, Greek language, but there were 4 different kings. There are 2 of those kings that are primarily commented on here in Daniel 11, because there were really only 2 of these 4 successors who continued to interact with Jerusalem and the land of Judea. And that was the Seleucid kingdom north of Jerusalem and the Ptolemaic kingdom south of Jerusalem. And so throughout the rest of Daniel 11, the term the king of the north and the king of the south are used. So it describes, as we begin to go through Daniel 11, a very detailed prophecy of the interaction historically between the Seleucids of the south and the Ptolemies of the south and the Seleucids of the north. And I'm not going to go through all the historical details, but most of the commentaries are fairly good because the details are given so clearly here in Daniel 11. Most of the commentaries will sort of take you down through the events and the marriages and the battles here that occurred anciently. But as you begin to get on down here in Daniel chapter 11, we begin to focus on an individual who is a type of an end-time ruler, because Daniel 11 makes a transition. When you get to Daniel chapter 11 and verse 35, it brings us down even to the time of the end. And from Daniel 11:35 on down through the close of the book of Daniel, the focus is on the end time. But there were events that occurred earlier that were types of end-time events. This particular king, described in Daniel 11:21, in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. And it talks about, with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. Now, here we get into something we're going to see directly ties into the events of Luke 21. It talks about this individual who comes to power, described as a vile person, someone who yet comes in peaceably and obtains the kingdom by flatteries. That is a description of this end-time civil, military, political ruler. An individual who in reality is going to be a very contemptible individual. And yet he will come in not by staging a military coup, but rather he will come in peaceably. He will obtain the kingdom by flatteries. It's interesting. There is certainly a parallel if you go back and read about Adolf Hitler, who was a vile person in many, many ways. Yet he came in peaceably and obtained the kingdom by flattery. He came to power there in Germany with a small group. Came in and he went through the political process, and he was wheeling and dealing and compromising and making promises, and was very, very, very clever. Very, very clever. Just because an individual is morally decadent and corrupt does not mean that they're not highly intelligent and highly capable. In fact, unfortunately, some of the most intelligent and capable men who have lived on this planet have also been very morally corrupt. And that is a very bad combination. You know, you think about it, wouldn't you rather deal with a dumb crook than a smart one? That's not a good combination, you know, intelligence and corruption. Well, let me show you back here in Daniel 8, where we were looking. Daniel 8, verse 23, in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. This understanding dark sentences is a reference to the occult, to an individual who will, in reality, be sort of in communion with evil spirits, an individual who is actually practicing that sort of thing. His power shall be mighty. Verse 24, but not by his own power. No, you know, if you go back to Revelation, we're told that the real power is the dragon. Satan the devil, that's the real power. So it's not just his human intelligence, it's not just his capacity, his ability, what he's able to put together on a human level. There is going to be on a spirit level. He will destroy wonderfully and prosper in practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. He shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace or by prosperity shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but shall be broken without hand. Now this, in Daniel 8, starts out talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, who was the literal fulfillment of this king of fierce countenance, this vile individual who obtained the kingdom by flatteries. But clearly, Daniel 8 goes beyond that, because it comes on down, it goes beyond Antiochus, it comes on down to this individual who will ultimately stand up against the Prince of Princes, against Jesus Christ, and will be broken without hand. In other words, will be destroyed, but not by human power. So, we have here in the book of Daniel Daniel starts out with the events of his day, brings them on down to an event that occurred well beyond his time, but an event that was a type of end-time events, and a certain individual who was a type of this final end-time individual called the beast in the book of Revelation. This king of fierce countenance, this individual. But now notice what we're told here in Daniel 8, and we'll go back and compare it with Daniel 11, that through his policy, verse 25, he shall cause craft, various strategies to prosper, and he will bring in prosperity. Well, Daniel 11 tells us that this individual, after Daniel 11:21, after he has obtained the kingdom by flatteries, he will come in a powerful way, and it talks about people being broken and the prince of the covenant, verse 22. Well, the historical fulfillment of that, under Antiochus Epiphanes, the high priest was certainly the prince of the covenant. He was the one who was the leader of those who were following the covenant. He was the prince of the covenant. Verse 23 of Daniel 11 talks about a league being made, a treaty being made. But after that treaty is made, he shall work deceitfully. He will come up and shall become strong with a small people. He shall enter peaceably even into the fattest places in the province. He shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. See, he shall, in the end, notice the end of verse 24, shall forecast his devices, his strategies against the strongholds for a time. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. The reality is, what is being described is a peaceable entry into the land of Israel. An individual who makes a league, who makes a covenant, who enters into an agreement. And yet, he's not a keeper of his word. He's not an individual who's going to keep the league or the agreement that he made. No, he will work deceitfully after he's done that. But he will come in and he will establish himself. He will be viewed as a friend, as one who is a bringer of peace. He will establish a league, but will, in the aftermath, work deceitfully. He will enter in peaceably. You see, Jesus said in Luke 21, when you see the armies encompassing Jerusalem, then know that the desolation thereof is near. Let those that are in Judea flee to the mountains. Brethren, if the armies that are encompassing Jerusalem are outwardly hostile armies, you know, somebody's coming and the bombers are coming in and the tanks are shooting out their great big mortar shells and troops are all around and they're converging. You don't need to look in the Bible to figure out that the desolation thereof is near. They're about to blow the whole place up and you see them coming. If the armies are hostile and are shooting as they come, number one, you know the desolation thereof is near, and number two, it's a little bit late to flee to the mountains. You know, if you are in a city that is under siege, and you look up and say, you know, I think it's about time for me to leave. I'll see you guys later. I'm heading to the mountains. If one bunch doesn't shoot you, the other one will. Either the ones in the city will shoot you as a traitor, or the ones on the outside who are attacking, you'll be killed as you come out. You see, Jesus Christ wasn't simply stating the obvious. When you see the armies attacking, know the whole place is about to be destroyed. No, Jesus Christ was telling you something, was telling us something that would not be clearly obvious unless we were told. Because this individual will have made a league. He will have made an agreement. He will have come in peaceably. His troops are going to be peacekeeping troops. But they're not going to keep the peace for very long. Jesus said, when this comes about, you had better know that the desolation thereof is near. And you had better flee to the mountains. Because if you don't, this is the unspoken implication, if you don't, you're going to find yourself trapped and it's going to be too late to get out. You have to leave in a time of peace. Because once all the calamities are taking place, it's too late. You're in a state of siege. There is destruction that is coming about. Now, notice here in Daniel, Jesus said in Luke 21, when you see these things, the armies encompassing Jerusalem, know that the desolation thereof is near. Now, as we come on down, let's notice here in Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 11 refers to this individual of whom Antiochus Epiphanes was a type. Daniel 11:31, arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and shall place the abomination that makes desolate. So he describes the daily sacrifice being stopped, and the abomination that makes desolate being placed. The abomination was something that was placed. Anciently, we know what happened. Antiochus Epiphanes not only stopped the daily sacrifices, but he placed a statue in the temple in Jerusalem, a statue of Jupiter Olympus. And this statue was set up, and the temple was, in that sense, rededicated to Jupiter. It's interesting that there is a similar statue that was carved somewhere in the neighborhood of at least 2,000 years ago, a statue of Jupiter Olympus that is still extant and used in a very prominent religious place in the world today. Now, they don't call the statue Jupiter Olympus, but that's who it was originally made of. It was worshipped as a statue of Jupiter Olympus. It was worshipped as the representation of Jupiter in Rome for centuries. But then you see, Emperor Constantine got a new religion. And he didn't worship Jupiter anymore. And so they took this great statue of Jupiter that had sat there in the temple in Rome, this great ebony statue with a scepter in its hand. And when Constantine built a palace for the Bishop of Rome, they took that statue and they cut the scepter out of his hand and replaced it with a ring of keys. And they set the statue up there in the palace of the Bishop of Rome, and they, sprinkled a little water on it and gave it a new name. You're not Jupiter Olympus anymore, now you're St. Peter. And to this day, you can go to Rome and you can see that great statue, which was carved over 2,000 years ago as a statue of Jupiter Olympus. It's still there. It's still extant. The only part of it that's missing is the big toe. It has been worn flat by the millions of people who've come through and have kissed it. Literally, over so many centuries, the toe there has just been worn away. People come through, and they stop and bow and kiss the toe of the statue. Well, if you run, however many million people have run through there, it's a wonder the foot is left, much less just the toe sort of worn off. It's very interesting because it was a very similar statue that was actually set up in the temple in Jerusalem in 167 by Antiochus Epiphanes. The daily sacrifice was stopped, and the abomination, that was specifically the abomination that was placed there, this great religious statute. All right. Daniel chapter 11 goes on through it, describes that. Now, notice as we come on through Daniel chapter 12, talking about a time when the archangel Michael will stand up. Chapter 12, verse 1, a time when there will have been a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, a time when those that are asleep will awake. Verse 2, a time when the righteous will shine, verse 3, as the brightness of the firmament. See, that's the time of the end. On down in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 11, Daniel is told, from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate set up, there shall be 1290 days. Blessed is he that waits and comes to the 1335 days, but go you your way till the end be. You shall rest and stand in your lot at the end of the days. Now, he just got through talking in verse 11 and verse 12 about two periods of days. 1290 days and then a period that's a month and a half longer, 1335 days. Daniel was told that he would die. He would rest. He would lie in the ground. He would sleep in the dust until the end. And then he would stand in his lot, his portion. Daniel, in other words, would die and he would be resurrected and receive his reward. When would he be resurrected? At the end of the days. Now, he just got through talking about two different periods of days. In other words, if you have two periods of days and they don't totally overlap, one's longer than the other. One's 45 days longer than the other. Well, they could start at the same time and end at different times, or they could end at the same time and start at different times. Based on Daniel 12:13, we would recognize that the days stop at the same time, at the time of the resurrection, the time when Daniel will stand in his lot, the time when he will awake, as it is described here in Daniel chapter 12. 1290 days, just over 3.5 years before the time of the resurrection, the time of the return of Jesus Christ. We're told in verse 11 that the daily sacrifice will be taken away and the abomination that makes desolate set up. Now, if you come back to Matthew 24, Jesus is speaking. We've already gone through the parallel account in Luke 21. But notice, as Christ is here talking about let's pick it up in verse 14. Matthew 24:14. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, then shall the end come. When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Oh, so what we read back in Daniel was not all over with. It was not just a matter of ancient history that occurred in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes. Jesus Christ is speaking, 200 years after the days of Antiochus. And he says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso reads, let him understand, then let them which be in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him that's on the housetop not come down. You need to pray that your flight be not in winter nor on the Sabbath. Verse 21, for then shall be great tribulation. You see, this is the event that will occur, that will bring about great tribulation. The tribulation will occur in the aftermath of the sacrifices being stopped and the abomination being set up. These events that are described talk about the things that are going to come about. Now, Luke tells us in Luke 21 that these things are occurring, and he tells us, coming on down in Luke 21:34, "Take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your heart be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness and cares of this life, so that day come upon you unawares. For as a snare shall it come on all them that dwell on the face of the whole earth. Watch you therefore and pray always, that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man." Jesus Christ said it was possible to escape. He told them in verse 20, "When you see Jerusalem encompassed with armies, know that the desolation thereof is near." You see, first come the armies. Then comes the cessation of daily sacrifices. Then comes the abomination. Then comes the desolation of Jerusalem. It describes it in Zechariah 14, and it talks about the city is taken, and half the city is sent forth into captivity. See, in Zechariah 14, the city is taken, describes in Zechariah 14:2. Half the city will go into captivity. So here is an event that is described. See, it talks about how that Jerusalem will be trodden down of the Gentiles, Luke 21:24, till the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Well, Revelation 11 says, Revelation 11 verse 2 talks about that the holy city, latter part, the holy city shall they, the Gentiles, tread underfoot 42 months. 42 months is 1,260 days. It's exactly 3.5 years. What we see is, you put the time sequence together, is a series of events. Jerusalem will be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. That will culminate at the return of Christ. The times of the Gentiles will be the 42 months, 1,260 days, that they will have total control. That will be the time period during which the two witnesses are prophesying in Jerusalem. It will be a time of great, intense pressure and persecution. But Jesus told His disciples to be on the lookout for certain events that they might flee before that desolation occurs. He warned them in the latter part of Luke 21 to be spiritually alert, so that they would not be taken by surprise. Watch and pray always, that you may be accounted worthy to escape. It is possible to escape these horrendous events that are going to be poured out. Those who are spiritually alert, those who are close to God and walking with God, that escape is described in Revelation chapter 12. Revelation chapter 12, it describes here the time when the series of events. It begins back in the time of ancient Israel. Well, it starts actually back at the time when it talks about ancient Israel personified as a woman, the church. In verse 5, she brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. The child was caught up unto God, to His throne. Talking about the first coming of Christ and His ascension to heaven. And then the woman, the church, continuation right on. The church in the Old Testament, the church in the New Testament, is just a continuation of the church. Fled into the wilderness. And there was a period historically of 1,260 years during which the church was basically in very remote, out-of-the-way places and was away from the center of events. Then that period throughout the medieval time. Then in verse 7 it describes a war in heaven, and this is an end-time event, because if you're just going through the sequence in Revelation 12, Satan and his demons, the dragon and his angels, were cast out. Their place was not found anymore in heaven. They were not allowed access any longer. You know, Satan does have certain limited access. You can read in the book of Job about that. He's the accuser of the brethren who accuses them day and night, but there is coming a time when that access will be totally denied. Great dragon was cast out, verse 9, that old serpent called the devil and Satan. He was cast out into the earth. Then, as we come on down, it says, verse 12, Rejoice, you heavens, but woe to the inhabitants of the earth. The devil is come down, having great wrath, because he knows he has but a short time. He knows it's almost over. And when the dragon saw that he was cast unto the earth, he persecuted the woman, speaking of the church, and to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time, 3.5 years, from the face of the serpent. The serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, but the earth helped the woman, verse 16, swallowed up the flood. The dragon was wroth with the woman, verse 17, went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So there is a remnant who have the truth, who are left behind, undoubtedly described in Revelation 3 as the church at Laodicea, which is not rebuked for a lack of truth so much as a lack of zeal and commitment. They're rebuked for having a very complacent, self-satisfied attitude. It's not enough just to know the truth. You know, more fundamentally, there are issues of the heart. You know, sometime back a number of years ago, as certain events happened, many people thought, well, you know, what was important was if you knew the truth. Knowing the truth is important. Holding on to the truth, that's very important. But you know, we're not only tested in terms of knowledge of the truth and of doctrine. We're also tested in areas of faith, areas of humility, areas of love. Faith, hope, and love, these 3, the greatest of them is love. You know, all of these areas are areas of test. And so we find described here a series of events. As you put the story together, I think what we see, this mysterious number of this 1,335 days mentioned in Daniel chapter 12. That may very well be the time when, that may very well be the time when armies are peacefully surrounding Jerusalem. When events are there that 45 days later are going to come to a grinding halt, because what happens 45 days after that? Well, the daily sacrifice is stopped, which sets in motion a sequence of events that results in Jerusalem being taken, and actually people deported, taken into captivity, the destruction of the house of Israel, all occurring over the course of the next month. What we find is that Christ gave warnings. And He talked about the fact that these things were going to occur, calamitous events were going to occur. And He said, you know, the real key is to don't go to sleep spiritually. Watch. Be alert. It doesn't mean just to, I think sometimes we have sort of thought, well, you know, watch. That means you ought to keep up with the news. Well, the word means to be awake, to be alert, to be on the lookout. Certainly it includes, it's good to be aware of what's happening in the world around us as prophecy unfolds. But if you're not alert to yourself and your relationship with God, watching world news, why, there folks work for CNN. That's their job. That's what they do day in and day out. But they're not going to be protected by God, and they're not going to understand what's happening then any more than they understood what was happening back in 1989 when the whole map of Europe changed with the collapse of the communist governments in Eastern Europe. No, we're to watch. and to pray, to be alert, to be on the lookout. Jesus Christ talks about this time of calamity, about the time of people being very fearful, verse 26. But notice what he says in verse 28. When these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draws near. The future is not something to be frightened of. Christ said that it was possible to be protected, to be spared. These end-time events are going to pour out. There's a lot more. We can't go into all of it here in the sermon. But Christ said, you know, when you see these things beginning to come to pass, that's not the time to get frightened and scared and go hide in the corner. Look up and lift up your heads. Your redemption draws near. Understand, this age is drawing to a close, and a new, far greater, far better age, the time of the kingdom of God, is at hand. As we see these events unfolding in the world around us, we ought to take note. But all the more, we ought to spiritually draw close to God, to lift up our heads, to look and recognize our redemption draws near.
Additional programs and literature available at hwalibrary.com.